Craig, or what have you going to introduce Steve? Not that he needs to be introduced.
No, I don't think it needs to be introduced.
I'll do a little self-intro. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So bow your heads and we'll say a prayer. O Lord, I trust in your merciful love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord who has been bountiful with me. Throw your cares on the Lord and he will support you. I will recount all your wonders. I will rejoice in you and be glad and sing psalms to your name, O Most High. Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, who is coming into this world again. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, Steve, you're up.
Okay. So I never want to assume. So I'm Steve Clark. I'm currently a pastor at Concord Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, Delaware. And though it's another state, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's not that far away. So it's a 20-minute drive from where Jenny and I live. My wife, Jenny, is one of the associates there at Westminster. Our son, Chris, is the youth director there. So lots of connections with Westminster. And it is a pleasure to be here. So, you know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, why Bonhoeffer? I first came into contact with Dietrich Bonhoeffer when I was a brand new Christian in college and was part of an intervarsity fellowship. And someone introduced me to the Cost of Discipleship. And that really caught my imagination. And I've kind of had interactions and, you know, done some readings of his books, Life Together, Ethics. I have some older paperback versions. So that was kind of it. I'd quote him now and then. But in 2018, I had the privilege of what I consider the trip of a lifetime. I went to Berlin and audited a doctoral course. Audit's the fun part. You get to do all the learning and reading, but you don't have to write the papers. And so I spent a week in Berlin and I'll show a picture of the house, in the house where Bonhoeffer lived for the last 8 or 9 years of his life with his family. It's now a place where you can go and tour and see it. It's been kept pretty much as it was when Dietrich lived there, including his room. All is there. So I got to spend a week there and we traveled around to different spots in Berlin that were notable to him. So that really then stimulated my interest even more. Side note, biographically, that was a special fun trip because that was my first trip back to Germany since I had lived there in the early 60s when it was West Germany. My father was in the Air Force and we lived in West Germany in 1961 to 64. So it was a joy to go back. And it just really got me interested and realized, you know, it's like probably most historical figures, when you dig into them, they're way more interesting and nuanced than sort of the cardboard cutout figures. So I find Bonhoeffer really, really interesting. I will say before I start the slide, one of the things I'll point out, Bonhoeffer was just over 39 years old when he died, executed, murdered by the Nazis. But the impact that he left is just hard to overestimate. A project was begun, 20 or 30 years ago to gather all of the writings, letters, lectures, books, original manuscripts, and gather them together in a whole series. And so it's called the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works. I think it may still be added to. Then they came out and began an English edition. To give you a sense of it, this is one volume and there are about 16 of them. That's how much in that, and his writings only began when he was 21. So we're really talking less than 20 years. And so it includes writings to him, from him, lectures he gave. One of the things to know is that in many cases, especially lectures and even some sermons, we don't have his manuscript, but in the university system of that day in Germany, and I'm told it may still be true to this day, students took almost verbatim notes. And so we have many of those, and by comparing different students' notes, they've been able to reconstruct with pretty significant accuracy what he said in those lectures and sermons. So he had a lot to say and write. Now I'm going to share my screen. And let me get that and go here. All right, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see the slideshow.
Yep.
Let me go to the
Go.
beginning. All right, can you see that now?
That's perfect.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I needed to get it bigger. Okay, so you see there, he born in February 1906, died in April of 1945. That's actually a picture of him during his prison time in 1943 and 44. You see that, 39 years old and what he accomplished. He was born into a fairly well-to-do German family. He was the 6th of 8 children. There's Paula, the mother in the middle with the 2. He was a twin. So that's him with the Dutch boy haircut, and his sister Sabine. They were very close. This is a picture of them probably about that same time. This is a picture of Dietrich with his sister in London in 1939. When things were getting really hot in Germany, Hitler was in power, the war had started, the US was not yet involved. Some friends arranged for him to go back to New York, to Union, to do some lectures and other things so he could be safe. He did, but actually on the boat trip to the United States, he decided he couldn't stay. So he was in the US just a few weeks and turned around and went back. He felt like, if I don't stay for the struggle, both within the church and in the country, I have no right to have any voice in what comes after. So on his way back to Germany, he stops in London, visits his sister. He had helped get her and her husband out of the country a few years before, when the Germans were really starting to clamp down on the Jews. And Sabine's husband was a lawyer with Jewish heritage, and so they were under threat, and so he'd helped get them to London. He saw her, visited her in 1939. That was the last time they saw each other. Part of a big family, cousins, sisters, brothers. This is a picture of a big family gathering when Carl, the father, was having his 75th birthday. There's Carl, there's Paula. Way over here on the side is Dietrich. That big gathering, that's actually behind that is the house where we had our classes. It's the house where the family moved in 1935. And that's where Bonhoeffer was when he was arrested. Interesting thing about this picture is 4 days after that, this is late night. This is the last day of March 1943. It's Papa's 75th birthday, and 4 days later, Dietrich and 2 of the family members will be arrested and put into prison. So Dietrich, one of his sisters, and her sister's husband. The sister will be released, but Dietrich and his brother will stay in prison for the rest of their lives. Well-to-do family. This was their house in a place called Grunwald, what is now a suburb of Berlin. That was their this was their vacation house. In 1935, they moved to a bit smaller place. This is called the Bonhoeffer house. That's where that big family picture was taken. That's where the family moved in 1935. Dietrich was the only child to live in that house. Others had moved away, had been married, but he had a bedroom in the upper floor, which was really the 3rd floor. You can see the dormer windows. That's where he lived off and on because he was traveling sometimes from 1935 until when he was arrested in 1943. Fairly well-to-do family. His mother, both of his family parents came from well-to-do backgrounds. His mother was a child of clergy, several clergy, pastors, bishops. In fact, her father had been a chaplain for the Kaiser at one point. His father was a psychiatrist and eventually became the department head for psychiatry and neurology at a big university in Berlin. So fairly well-to-do. Very involved and interested in civic engagement. Interestingly enough, not a church-going family. They had church-going connections. Hardly ever went to church. Kind of more humanists than anything. But Bonhoeffer at an early age just felt the tug of God. This is my language, not his. When he decided at age 15 he was going to study theology, his older brothers, because Bonhoeffer was 6th of 8 children, the youngest brother, he said, well, I'm going to become a theologian. And his brothers said, the church is just useless. It's just not helpful. And Bonhoeffer at 15 says, then I will reform it. So, that's the kind of passion he had. Prolific writer, as I showed that book earlier. So at age 21, his doctoral dissertation was approved. Imagine that. So he got his doctorate at age 21. It was a book or a thesis that was eventually published under the title Sanctorum Communio, which means holy community, or it was his idea of the church as the Holy Communion or Holy Church. Act and being in the German system, you did a dissertation to get your doctorate, but before you could teach, you had to do another not quite as long dissertation / thesis. He did that. It was really, so he wrote very philosophical, was published as Act and Being. Then he did a series of lectures on Genesis story. It came out as Creation and Fall. The book that most people may be familiar with is, we talked about this earlier, what we know of as the Cost of Discipleship. That was the English publisher's title. Bonhoeffer's title was simply the German word Nachfolge, which means following. So simply discipleship. And in many ways, that title reflects that for Bonhoeffer, discipleship was by nature, real discipleship was by nature costly. So the cost of discipleship would have been, repetitive. And then Life Together, which he wrote reflecting on community life at an illegal seminary he helped lead. He started writing a book on ethics. He was in the midst of working on that book when the Gestapo arrested him in April 1943. When I was there, I got to visit, and go in his room. It's still, you can go to the room, set up, it's a bed. Everything is as it was when they came and got him. Fortunately, he had hidden the manuscript in the attic of the house, and friends later came and got it. It was not a finished work. So if you read it, you'll notice, especially towards the end, sort of scattered feel of it because he didn't finish it. He was actually, when he was in prison, he started working on the outline of another book, which we'll talk about. And then what many of us are familiar with is all these letters and papers he wrote while he was in prison. We have those letters and papers. Let me go back. We have those letters and papers because he was not supposed to be able to, have that kind of communication, but there was a friendly guard who smuggled letters out and in while he was in the military prison. So he wrote a lot, studied a lot, became ordained as a pastor, led confirmation classes. There's all kinds of fascinating things about Bonhoeffer I won't get into. He spent a year in New York City, Union Theological Seminary. You see the dates there. We're talking the beginning of the Great Depression. We're also talking about the beginning of the rise to power of Hitler and the Nazis. Here's a picture of Bonhoeffer with the class, and I forgot to circle him, but a couple of interesting figures. This is Reinhold Niebuhr, familiar to many folks in theology. If you're not familiar with him, he's the one famous for the Serenity Prayer that we've heard of. Another interesting figure is Frank Fischer. And Frank and Bonhoeffer became close friends. And because of Frank Fischer, Bonhoeffer became very involved in his year at Union at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And that's the church he connected to. In fact, he was not very complimentary and not very impressed by the American church. What he found where there was real life was in the Black church. And he attended there. He taught an adult Bible class. People remembered him for years. Interesting sidelight. So Frank Fisher, who actually apparently to his family was known as Al or Albert. I was doing a presentation like this to a small group of retired pastors at Riddle Village with Bob Bell. And later that day, Bob sent me an email, and he had met a new resident there who turns out to be one of Frank Fisher's daughters. And she said, "Oh, I remember Dad talking about Bonhoeffer." So when we're no longer under these limitations, I'd love to meet her and hear whatever stories she may remember. That his time at Union was a kind of turning point for him for two reasons. I think one was his exposure to the Black church, to the energy there. He felt the American church, which was a lot of it was at Union and other places, focused on the social gospel, which he was impressed by the social activism, but he thought it really had a pretty shallow theological basis. Theology in Germany was all about history at best, very, very liberal. So it gave him appreciation for the power of the Black church. He became very enamored of gospel music and brought home every single gospel record he could find. And when he was teaching and preaching, and when he was leading confirmation classes, when he would always introduce them to the gospel music. It also gave him an insight into the poor and the people who are poor and struggling, which was happening at least as much in Germany at this time, affected not only by the Great Depression, but all the effects of the First World War and the requirements and restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. So he began, this pretty well-to-do, upper-class, comfortable person, began to think about what he called the view from below, and began to see life differently. He also, when he returned to Germany, all the political upheaval with the rise of the Nazis was happening. This is one of the things, 10 years later, not long before he went to prison, he was reflecting on the 10 years, so when he's writing it at the beginning of 43, he's thinking back 10 years, which is the time when Hitler and the Nazis come to full power. And he talks about the value of seeing things from below. And that will shape a lot of his theology for the rest of his life. Of course, the rise of the Nazis and the church's complicity. You see, there's the Reich bishop. So the church became, in Bonhoeffer's eyes, and many historically, very complicit. Hitler had this phrase, and there was a German word for it, synchronization, everything working together. So the church, which of course was a state church already, the Lutheran church, was co-opted into the Nazi movement, even to the point, so because it was a state church, pastors were civil servants, and at one point they finally, there was a loyalty oath required of pastors, loyalty to the Reich and loyalty to Hitler personally. And that started an offshoot and a sort of a protest movement, an offshoot called what we know of as the Confessing Church. He helped start and lead a confessing church seminary. He was beginning to be outlawed and restricted from speaking, preaching, teaching. He helped found a church seminary at Finkenwalde to train pastors. That's actually where he tried experiments in communal life that he talks about in the book Life Together. In 38, his brother-in-law, Hans von Donanyi, there circled, worked in the Abwehr, which was the military intelligence arm in Germany. And it actually was the locus of resistance to Hitler almost from the beginning. And his brother-in-law got Bonhoeffer to work with them. Bonhoeffer did a lot of ecumenical work, was always traveling to conferences. So it was a way, what Bonhoeffer essentially did was he could communicate to the outside world what was really happening in Germany, because German propaganda painted a very rosy picture. So by the late 30s, he's now part of the resistance. In April of 1943, as I mentioned, he and several others are arrested. And they're arrested at that point because they're suspected of what is in fact true. They were helping sneak Jews out of Germany. So he's arrested, he's thrown to military prison. On the right is his cell, on the left is the view from his cell. There he is with some prisoners, including what I believe is an Italian officer there in the middle. You can see it didn't look like too much hardship, although it was prison. So it's a military prison in Tegel, which is a suburb of Berlin. He was there for about a month when they discovered that the commandant of the prison was a cousin of his mother. So with her help, he ended up getting sort of relatively mild treatment for the rest of his time there at that prison. It's there where he wrote his, letters and papers from prison. Part of the gift of that being in Berlin was we went to the State Library in Berlin, which has all of his originals. We got to see the originals of many of these letters. We also got to see the original of his doctoral thesis. Eventually what happens, and if you're familiar with the movie Valkyrie, which is about the assassination attempt on Hitler by Tom Cruise, so there had actually been they had tried this resistance to see if they could get the military to stage a coup and reach out to the Allies and say, if we did, could we have a peace treaty or an armistice? The Allies, for all kinds of reasons, were not very receptive. So then they attempted to assassinate Hitler. There were a couple of unsuccessful attempts. Remember, Bonhoeffer and others are in prison right now just for trying to sneak Jews out of Germany. In late 1944, well, in July of 44, a final attempt is made. Bomb goes off on this table, Hitler escapes, others die. They find the people and they find some papers and they discover Bonhoeffer's part in the whole larger conspiracy, as well as his brother-in-law and others. And so Bonhoeffer then is transferred into Gestapo custody, and in October of 1944. And that's actually the last we hear of him or hear from him, because, and we can only imagine what he endured beginning in October. There's no more letters mailed, no more letters snuck out or whatever. He's transferred to the Gestapo prison. We're talking late 44, early 45. The war is clearly being lost by the Germans. Berlin's being bombed on a regular basis. And so at first he's in the Gestapo prison in Berlin, but then they start moving the prisoners around. In April of 1945, he ends up at a camp called Flossenburg, which is in southeast Germany. And on the night of April 8th, he and several others are brought in Flossenburg. Late that night, there's a kangaroo court. And in the early morning of April 9th, he is hanged in this courtyard. This is what the courtyard looks today. They've removed some of it. Bonhoeffer's cell was down in what's left of that building. Flossenburg was not a concentration camp as we think of it. It was a labor camp. It had been around for a long time, and there were a lot of Soviet and Polish prisoners. So it wasn't like they had gas chambers and like that, but when people died, their bodies were burned. In the background, you see one of the incinerators. And Bonhoeffer's remains are probably in this pyramid. It was just a mass grave. And so, and in that courtyard is this memorial to those who were killed there. And I forgot where I put the translation, but it's honoring them for their resistance to tyranny. So Bonhoeffer's thinking, so I talk about the will of God and faithfulness. And one of the fascinating things and fun things I find about reading Bonhoeffer is watching the evolution, if you will, or the progress of his thinking. There's things that from the very beginning, from his doctoral thesis right to his last writings, are consistent, but they start to have some nuances. But there's also some significant changes. So when Bonhoeffer's writing his doctoral thesis in 1927, or in the year or two leading up to that. So Germany is pushing back and chafing under the limitations of the Versailles Treaty. For which you're not familiar with it, basically, the Allies wrote this treaty that said the whole war was all of Germany's fault, and you have to pay us back, and you can't have arms anymore, and we can. And so nationalism was very strong leading up to World War I, through World War I, and of course then as the Germans feel more and more like victims. This was something that Hitler knew how to play on. And one of the interesting things here is this sense of nationalism and God being on our side. So he writes this phrase, there is a will of God with a people just as with individuals. So think of the word Volk. So with a Volk, just as with individuals. And Volk became a buzzword. Where a people, thinking about this, there's some agitation that we're going to need to fight our way out of this, where a people submitting in conscience to God's will goes to war in order to fulfill its historical purpose and mission in the world. So this idea nations have a purpose in God, though entering fully into the ambiguity of human sinful action. So we know it's ambiguous. It knows it's been called upon by God, that history is to be made here. Here war is no longer murder. So you see him basically sanctioning, if Germany feels called by God to go to war for the sake of its people, then by golly, there's nothing wrong with that. So that's Bonhoeffer in 1927. Think about where then he will write this, and this is also important to keep in mind. He will give a series of lectures at a church where he's serving in Barcelona, Spain. And as part of his lecture on ethics, he will say there are no acts that are bad in and of themselves. Even murder can be sanctified. There is only faithfulness to or deviation from God's will. There is no law with a specific content, but only the law of freedom. That is, bearing responsibility alone before God and oneself. So we're starting to see this real strong theme that will stay with him, that faithfulness, there are no universal, timeless, general principles that we follow as Christians. We follow Jesus. And the question becomes not what's the general principle, but what is God's call in this moment for this situation? We will see that theme run. So he's even saying even murder can be sanctified, which is an interesting thought, knowing he will go through a phase where he feels drawn to pacifism. Depending on which scholar you read, they either say he was a pacifist or not quite. One of the things that was true in Germany at that time, he was trying to avoid being drafted. And there was no conscientious objection was a capital crime. So if you conscientiously objected to the war, they didn't give you a non-combat role. You were imprisoned and executed. So then to go from that to actually be part of an assassination plot, which is kind of interesting. So there's no timeless principle. It's just, what does God want now? How does the church know what God's command is? Not biblical law, established orders of creation. That's a phrase that comes out of German theology. We won't go into that. So there's no law. You can't go to a law, you go to God. Only from Christ can we know God's command. And then in 1941, as according to his closest friend, Eberhard Bethke, he said to his brother-in-law, murder. So they're clearly talking about what they're going to do about Hitler. He says to his brother-in-law, who's the military guy, murder is still murder, even when, as in the case of Hitler, it is absolutely necessary. One must be prepared to take the guilt for this sin upon oneself. That's the powerful phrase. One must be prepared to take the guilt for this sin. What we're seeing is Bonhoeffer's insistence, and you see some hints at it early in his writing, but by the end of his life, he's making very clear, you have to figure out, discern, we might say, what is God calling me to do right now? There's no timeless principles. He found the Sermon on the Mount really critical, right? But what does it mean in this given situation to love my enemy? What does it mean in this given situation? I'm trying to draw on all those rules and regs we would say, but what does it mean here and now? So Jesus, what do you want me to do? And in doing so, if it's the right move, we can never be 100% certain. And so we will have some guilt. We will never get it. Not only can we never be 100% certain, we are never free of sin completely. So there will always be something not quite right about what we do, and we will have guilt. But if you think back to, if you know the cost of discipleship, then that's where grace, that's the costly grace. Not grace like, well, I'll do this and Jesus will forgive me, but I'm going to do this because it's the best I can figure out. I'm going to do it. And yet I know it will be imperfect. But that's where God's grace then comes in. It's not that I'm not guilty, but Christ takes that guilt. That's a real, I find that a really powerful idea. Because one of the things that Bonhoeffer increasingly got frustrated by was not only the blatant disregard for the gospel and God's will on the part of the larger church, what he called they called themselves the German Christians, who had been completely co-opted by Nazis, but that counter movement called the confessing church, he felt like they weren't stepping up, and the ecumenical movement too. They were making pronouncements and looking for principles, but they weren't really acting because they weren't sure what the right thing was. And so he rebelled against what he called phraseology. He wanted the concrete. What are we doing here and now? Now, he also was not a big fan of what he saw was the American leaning towards activism without a good theological basis. So we have to pray, think, talk, discern, and then act. So we don't just act because we want to do good. And we don't just sit and think and then write principles. We act, but we do so knowing that we'll never get it 100% right. Somebody even wrote a book, a fairly short book. It was their doctoral thesis sometime in the last 10 years. And I think it might be in the reading list that I sent to Craig, called Anyone Who Acts Responsibly Becomes Guilty, which is sort of a summary. But he keeps going back to from his doctoral thesis at the beginning to the very end. What we always need to remember is we are the people who live by the forgiveness of sins. It's the crucified Christ by whom we are forgiven. And so key concepts as we'll come towards the end of this. This is where we talked earlier about translation. So one of his key phrases in many of his writings was Stellvertretung, which in recent translations and in this giant series of books is translated as vicarious representative action. You see the Germans stick a bunch of words into one, or place sharing. The idea is that I do something on behalf of you or on behalf of a whole people. So, of course, the model for this is Christ, who is the vicarious representative of the human race, right? Paul said, just as in one man died, all are raised. So Christ enacts Stellvertretung on behalf of us. And then the church as the body, and then Christians as individuals, we live out our lives on behalf of others. I will stand in your place, which is interesting because in some ways, that's what Bonhoeffer felt he was doing in being part of trying to overthrow the Nazis, was that whatever suffering would befall him, whatever price he had to pay, he was doing it, and he had hoped the church would do it on behalf of the whole German people, and in some ways on behalf of the world. Because while, he despised the Nazis, and I should say in passing, his whole family were opponents. There were many of them who were plotting One of the things against the Nazis, almost from the beginning, one of the things about that house that I showed you was the last place where they lived, was it was at the end of a cul-de-sac, and though it's surrounded by apartments and houses now, it was woods. So the cul-de-sac meant they could see down the road if one of the big Nazi, police cars or command cars was coming down the road, and hide whatever they needed to hide. And the woods were places they could go back and talk. So this idea that we, on behalf of God and as agents of God, we act for others. So that's a key concept. And the church always has to be the church for others, or it's not the church. And again, freedom and responsibility. There are no acts that are bad in and of themselves. Even murder can be sanctified. There's only faithfulness to or deviation from God's will. There's no law with a specific content, but only the law of freedom. That is bearing responsibility alone before God and oneself. And one of the interesting things I think, and the kind of really, I find really interesting things, is to just, we know enough, think about his life. And of course, his life is sort of in stark terms, what he was dealing with, the country, all the politics, the threats, is to see what he writes. These kind of words, sort of interesting theologically, but think about him writing those words. This is when he's a pastor in Barcelona. He's still young. All you have to do, or all that we must do as Christians and the church must do, is we have freedom, right? We have free will to act. That's the only law. And then we have to use that freedom to act according to what we understand God's will for that moment. And then, as it says in the closing line, bearing responsibility alone. So think about at the end of his life, as he's deciding what to do and how to be part of this, he's not making excuses. And what I did and I'm doing may not have been 100% right. And I'm sure it wasn't, but that's where God's grace comes in. So I have freedom to act and responsibility to act, and then I end up with guilt. Part of what was happening to Bonhoeffer too was, while he's thinking about all of that, is he's growing disenchanted with the church. And religion is one of those funny words that, depending on how you're using it or who's using it, can be seen as a positive or negative. So Bonhoeffer starts to use that word in a negative way. He's not long before he will be thrown into prison, he's telling his friend Eberhard Bethke, I'm feeling like all that's religious, I'm getting opposed to all that's religious. And I think of, so he's seeing religion as the structure, as all this theology and dogma that's floating around. And part of it has to be that he's just seeing the church fail. And so he's, I must constantly think of God, of Christ. Authenticity, life, freedom, and mercy mean a great deal to me. It's only that the religious clothes they wear make me so uncomfortable. So it's not the kind of ideas at the core of religion, it's the way religion is playing out. And that's a critique probably a lot of us could make and have made. When he was in prison, he began working on the outline for a book, and they smuggled out some of his notes. And one of the things that Bonhoeffer from the beginning was, where do we meet God, right? Where is Christ in the world? How do we know who God is and what God's up to? For most German theologians in the first part of the 20th century, that wasn't a question that mattered at all. They studied the Bible and theology, basically say, as history. What did people think about God? How did they come to believe? Karl Barth started a kind of revolution where he said, oh no, God's really speaking, and God reveals God's self through Scripture. So we dive back into Scripture. Bonhoeffer was a fan and critic of Barth, but he was amazed by what he saw as a theological revolution. But for Bonhoeffer, he didn't think Barth had gone far enough. And for Bonhoeffer, the primary place of revelation where Christ is revealed is in the church. And so the church is Christ's presence in the world. He took seriously Paul's language of you are the body of Christ. And if the church is Christ's body, if the church is the fundamental primary locus of Christ in the world, then the church must, I'll use the word mimic or imitate or embody Christ. Jesus was, he would say, the man with others, right? There's the incarnation, and then for others. And if the church is going to be the church, then we have to be for others. So where we meet Christ is in the church, where we are meeting people who for others. Where do we meet the transcendent God? Not in, meditation or some sort of ethereal way, but in what is he? But the neighbor within reach, God in human form. So it's like the incarnation keeps happening. I'll close with this. This is April 1944. He's in prison. He's been in prison for a year. By this point, he's sensing, so they've been fighting a legal battle to get him out. And at the beginning, he and his family feel pretty confident he's going to be able to get out. They don't have enough evidence. They don't have evidence really on these charges of helping Jews to escape. But by April, he's realizing maybe not. And in a letter to his friend, he says, what keeps gnawing at me is the question, what is Christianity, or who is Christ actually for us today? What does a church, a congregation, a sermon, a liturgy, a Christian life mean in a religionless world? And for him, a religionless world wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Again, thinking religion is that structure and shape. It's not that there isn't the gospel, that it isn't true that God was in Christ. It's how we've wrapped it up. How do we speak, or perhaps we can no longer even speak the way we used to, in a worldly way about God? So how do we speak the world's language? How do we go about being religionless worldly Christians? How can we be ecclesia? That's the word, the Greek word in the New Testament that's usually translated church. How can we be those who are called out without understanding ourselves as privileged, which he felt like the church had kind of seen itself as privileged? Put that in the context of a state church. Interesting thought about in our own context, where it seems a lot of Christians, what they're pushing back against is we don't have the central place in the culture that we used to. But instead, we see ourselves as belonging wholly to the world, right? We are the church, not for us. We are the church for the world. That's what it means to be the church, just like Christ was for the world. So that was his question. What is Christianity? Who is Christ actually for us today? And why should it matter? And he was wrestling with all those questions and how to behave. You act with no timeless principle. We don't follow principles or laws. We follow Christ. And we try and listen and learn. We do the best we can. And then when we get it wrong, or partly wrong or partly right, that's where grace comes in. But we can't shrink from acting simply because we might not get it right. We'll stop at that point. So I hope I provided some enlightenment more than confusion. There's so much that can be said about Bonhoeffer and come at him. So questions, comments, pushback?
Yeah, Steve, I got one.
Yeah.
Back in the beginning, you talked about how the German Lutheran Church became co-opted by the Reich and by Hitler's regime.
Right.
Bonhoeffer and some of his cohorts created or formed the Confessing Church.
Right.
After the Second World War, and we look at what the Lutheran Church is today in Germany, are its roots, are its foundations more to the Confessing Church thoughts that they developed, or still the state, still the old state church? It's still a state church, but
Right.
where are their belief foundations today? Do you know?
That's a really good question. So for one thing, I feel confident the church doesn't have the place in the culture that it used to, because many people saw how it sold out. One of the hard things for the church, when I was in this class, one of the students in the class was actually a student who was ending up his year internship at a church in Berlin. So he had some interesting insights. And one of the books I recommend is really helpful too on this, not directly about Bonhoeffer, but the Germans still have, and again, I'm saying this from people who told me, Germans are still of mixed minds about the war and Hitler, right? So there are still people. So for many people, Bonhoeffer, who's probably become a much more positive figure, but Bonhoeffer in many people's minds early on was a traitor. Yes, not Hitler was bad, but he was our bad, right? So he was part of a conspiracy to overthrow the government. So that's one part of it. And then the Germans are of a mixed mind about even Hitler and about the Nazis and about the war. So my sense is that the Lutheran Church today, one, it doesn't have the status it used to, that it probably is, I would think of it, because I don't know a whole lot about both of those, it probably returned somewhat to what the Lutheran Church was before Hitler co-opted it. It is not as nationalistic, because even prior to Hitler, the church reflected its culture and the nationalism. So it's probably more, and it might depend on congregations too. But I think it's probably, it's not as, what would I want to call it? Progressive, not the right word. Revolutionary as the confessing church, or at least Bonhoeffer wanted the confessing church to be. It's probably more institutional.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Thank
it
you.
is interesting, the effect of the war, because what somebody was telling me too was, it's really interesting that whole energy of Nazism is like, even when Germany plays in the World Cup, and they win, you don't like, Germany. It's like people kind of, that feels a little bit too much like Nuremberg, right? And all the rallies. So it's a weird kind of thing. Yeah. It's still a state church. It's still privileged, but it doesn't have the Lutheran Church, but it doesn't have quite the same stature that it used to.
Dan, you've got a question.
Yes, see, this is great. What an opportunity you had. That's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Two things. You made an original statement about the fact that he was, so there's so much more to him than there's even people think about now. And you made that clear, I think. Question, two things. Is there anything after being through? Is there something that, sometimes the further you get into something or someone, there's disappointment that, is there anything there that from the other side that's less than what you had thought? Point one. Point two, your last, I call it slides, that's old language, whatever it is.
Yes, I know. It's like video. Yeah.
Yeah. What you had that on there, his statement, and is there anything from that or anything else that you could take and look at our world today, our country today, what's going on today? Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you take what he's saying and put that in today's language? Yeah.
So I'll take the second question first and then go back to the first one. So in terms of how to apply it today, of course, you may have been on, there's a book on the reading list called The Bonhoeffer Phenomenon, showing how at first Bonhoeffer wasn't really hardly heard of. And then in the late 40s, so 5 years after the war, his letters started being released. That was the first thing. I lost my train of thought. COVID brain.
COVID.
Oh, yes. So people have looked at, okay, how might it apply today? So there's two books that could be helpful in that regard. One is called Religionless Christianity. That's a phrase that Bonhoeffer used. In fact, when he spoke, it's interesting, for an unchurched family, he preached baptism sermons for two of his nephews. They were preached at gatherings in his home, partly because at that point, he wasn't allowed to preach anymore. Remember, he's a civil servant. So so he, but he wrote a baptism sermon while he was in prison for the baptism of the child of his dear friend Eberhard Bethge. And if you get into Bonhoeffer, you discover Bethge's the one we owe a huge debt, because he's the one that's preserved and gathered Bonhoeffer's writings. He was a seminary student. And he wrote a baptism sermon for Eberhard's first child, who Eberhard named Dietrich. And in that baptism sermon, he talks about, being baptized into the church, and this is what lies ahead. And this is in, I believe, 44. So he sees it all crumbling. He basically is saying, we're coming to, and he sees the war is going to be lost. We're coming to the end of something, both as a country and as a church and as a world. And we don't know what's coming after that. What I see, or if we're paying attention, what has been is going to end in some way. So what comes next? And so for him, what he tried to say was, or what he wanted to say was, is that religionless? It can't be all about religion and buildings and pomp and all of that kind of stuff. Two things. We hang on to our liturgy and our religious practices, but that's not what we show the world. That's not our face to the world. We still do that stuff because that's what makes us a community. But as far as the world's concerned, we do two things. We pray for people, we pray for the world, and then we act towards justice. So he wanted the church to stop being concerned about power. This is my bias. Part of what I see the Christian church doing in the United States and has been doing for 50 years is trying to gain power. Right? Aligning itself with one party or another. How can we get power to get the laws the way we want them, to preserve, in some people's language, a Christian nation or whatever? So I would say, again, if you may or may not agree with Bonhoeffer or what I just said, but Bonhoeffer would say we've got to stop trying to be influential and act out of weakness and vulnerability and faithfulness. So Religionless Christianity is one of those books where it kind of unpacks that. Another one is a very brief book called 10 Years After. And again, it's on the reading list as well. And what that is I think Barrett or Barnett, it's on the list. She was one of the main translators to take all those 16 volumes of German stuff and put it into English. And she took Bonhoeffer's essay called 10 Years After, which he wrote looking back 10 years of dealing with the rise of Nazis and the church and all that stuff. And she took that and then wrote sort of a commentary around it and say, okay, what does that have to do with us today? So there's two resources you can go to. And then you can kind of do your own work and say, well, what does that mean for me and us? That's one of the things I think is interesting about Bonhoeffer. How do we apply what he said? Now, I will say, and I'll reveal, some of my bias, obviously. I think there are parallels in some of the stuff that's happened in our country and other countries to what happened in Nazi Germany. But let me just say, comparisons to Nazi Germany are always tricky, I think, because we jump ahead to the Holocaust and all of that. There are very few historical parallels to that. But I think we can look at the dynamics culturally, politically, and say, what can we learn? So I think there are lessons. It would be interesting to say. I think one of the things that's interesting to think about Bonhoeffer, if he had lived, right, what would he have done? What would he have worked towards? What would he have told the church it ought to be doing? In terms of kind of finding things disappointing, nothing yet.
Wow.
It is, I don't know if it's disappointing. I guess it's sort of enlightening because it was early in his writings and stuff to see how much he was caught up in the whole nationalistic, poor Germany, and it's all about peoples. Some of that was his Lutheran background. And part of what Bonhoeffer is doing is trying to interpret Luther and Lutheranism for his day. And to say, hey, what we've misinterpreted Luther, because part of what came out of Luther was this idea of the two kingdoms: the church, the kingdom of God, which is the church, and it has certain things to do, and the state, which is that kingdom which God established, and each has its role. and they stay in their lanes, right? So that's, think about that, how if deeply embedded that is, then the state can tell the church, here's what you need to do and all that. Well, Bonhoeffer tried many ways to say that's really not what Luther meant. And he would say, okay, especially when the whole Jewish question was arising, he wrote some pretty radical things in the context, and dangerous things, lectures and sermons, is to say the church has a role vis-a-vis the state. And he had, I think, 3 different things. And, if it feels the state's doing wrong, and it was various steps. And the final one was, he uses an image, basically, I'll put a stick in the spokes, right? So at some point you have this church may have to step in and be a problem for the state if the state is not doing its job of creating a place of justice and righteousness for all. But yeah, so he moved from, hey, if we are supposed to go to war to defend the German people from the French people, if that's God's will, then that's God's will. He didn't hang on to that very long.
Nick?
Steve, I want to throw this thought out to you, and you can then respond. I think there's a little bit of an innate conflict between the German worldview and Christianity.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, if you go back to the famous German philosopher Hegel believed that history moves through this kind of 3-step method. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis.
Right.
And therefore, the antithesis kind of creates a belief that, let's be realistic, men are going to fight wars, men are going to beat each other up, they're going to throw stones, but ultimately it resolves in some kind of compromise or synthesis that moves us forward in some way. But when you take Christianity at its core, forgetting about churches, and Jesus says, no, turn the other cheek. Don't throw stones at the harlot. I mean, he's basically arguing that we don't have to be that realistic. And in fact, the world itself is somewhat sinful. So we've got to rise above it and have a different ethics and values, or stronger ethics and values, where we say, no, it's not right to pick on the other guy, whether it's to move history or any other reason. So I think in Bonhoeffer, you got a little bit of both strains. You got, on the one hand, here's war. Wars are always going to happen. This guy's probably gone over, the line, and he should be stopped. But it's all kind of acceptable as kind of God's will and part of God's world. Whereas, we as Christians are really arguing the world should be different, that we really have to fundamentally change human nature so we don't have wars, and we shouldn't just accept them. So I think there's, a really interesting conflict between the German outlook and true Christianity. And if you take it another step, interestingly, the Russians, like if you look at Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which is one of my favorite books of all time, the main character kills the woman who owns, his rooming house. And he goes through all this sort of guilt and stuff. And at the end of that book, I think one of the most amazing things is they talk about the fact that when you look at judgment, that God looks at the atheists, the rapists, the worst people in the world, and he says, and you too shall enter the kingdom. And the other judges around him say, what are you doing? And he says, I'm doing this because not one of them thinks they deserve it. So in that last bit of humility, or understanding that they behaved badly, is almost where their salvation comes. So the Russians, even push a different thing. And it's interesting that the Russians and Germans over the years have had such conflict. And I think it's because of that difference in worldview that they have. And, we as Americans kind of fall somewhere in between. But I do think there's kind of an innate conflict in 3 versions of the world that we all look at. And it really messes up sometimes our understanding of Christianity.
Well, and I think, I think you've hit on is what I would say, and what I think Scripture says, and what Jesus and the prophets say, is there is an innate conflict between God's will and every cultural system. So what's the, and it's always easier to see it in others. What struck me is you talked about, the Hegelian, the dialectic, and Bonhoeffer could talk philosophy, and that's the stuff that makes my head hurt trying to read it. Even in English, I can't imagine in German. But because in fact, if you think about that whole freedom and responsibility, that's the right. So we're free and we're responsible, and he doesn't resolve that antithesis. He says the way you deal with that is that tension's always there, and the only thing that allows us to act in that tension is not to resolve and meet in the middle, but say forgiveness of sins, right? That it's God's action, and God's the ultimate. God is free, total freedom, and that's part of what Bonhoeffer wants to do. And I think he follows Luther closely in that. I don't want to limit God's freedom in any way. So if God says I'm supposed to do this, I'll do that, even if I'm not 100, even if it feels sort of wrong. But yeah, so and now I don't, the probably Bonhoeffer would say the greater conflict and tension between Christianity and the German worldview was less about dialectical theology than about the sense of the Volk as being a chosen people, right? Of being, I'll call it German exceptionalism. And so the sense that we have a unique role in history. And so because of that, we have to and are allowed to do certain things that otherwise wouldn't be appropriate. But I think you're right. There is that tension, and it's always interesting, to say, look at if that's the German mindset, what's our mindset, and how does that? And Bonhoeffer's critique, and not alone in this, is that my phrase is, we human beings have an immense capacity, almost infinite capacity, to delude ourselves and justify ourselves.
Dan Williams, you got a question.
Yes, when you think about what Bonhoeffer wrote in terms of war and murder, did his brother-in-law have to convince him to join the assassination plot, or was Bonhoeffer all for it from the very beginning? And if his brother had to convince him, what do you think changed?
Well, it's important to remember that when he first joined, it was a coup attempt. They were trying to overthrow Hitler. And Bonhoeffer, because of his ecumenical connections, especially through a British bishop, Bishop Bell, Bonhoeffer's part of this conspiracy group. He would go talk to Bishop Bell, and Bell would try and get in touch with Churchill and say, we've got this group of people who want to overthrow, and if they're successful, can we come to terms? Churchill and the Allied leadership were pretty skeptical. This guy is a young German pastor, what kinds of connect? But the other thing was, by that point, the Germans, and of course it happened early on, the Germans had committed so many atrocities pre-Holocaust. The way they treated prisoners, the Allies said, no, there's no coming to terms with this. We have to defeat. We're not even sure. So you put a different general in charge. How much is that? So Bonhoeffer joins a conspiracy to overthrow a government. By the time it gets to assassination, it's not clear. There's no sense that he wants to pull out. There is a sense in some of his writings, and he has to be careful, remember what he writes on that. He doesn't write a whole lot because the letters are being smuggled out, but he doesn't know who might see them. That I think is part of that, right? So he had been almost a pacifist, or very sympathetic to pacifism, basically because of a relationship with another international student when he was at Union in 30 and 31, who was a pacifist. So I think he struggled with that, but there was never a sense like, whoa, I don't want any part of this. I'm going to read into it. This is him with his profoundly concrete theology. seeing what's happening to his country and seeing what's happening to people, right? So as things progress, the whole Jewish question is growing and all of that. And if you, and you know, the Jewish question, the persecution, it was also about gypsies and gay and lesbians. You know, there was a euthanasia program for the handicapped. So there was awful evil around him. And that's where I think it feels like that's where his thinking led them. Do I go, well, hey, I'm you know, turn the other cheek. So I've got to do that. Do I turn the other cheek? What is turning the other cheek when somebody slaps me? What does that mean when they're not slapping me, but they're murdering others? So I never get a sense that he regretted that. And he was on the fringe, right? He was sort of a courier. It did confuse friends who knew he was very much opposed. Next thing you know, he's working for military intelligence. Karl Barth was like, what? And it was only after about 5 or 6 months when he had a chance to see Barth and explain what was really going on. But I don't get anywhere in his writings a sense, and again, with the caveat that he couldn't talk about it very explicitly, that he regretted it or wanted to pull out. He argued with his brother-in-law about what it meant.
Turning the other
In
cheek.
today's Germany, do you have any feeling, any reading on what the current Germans' public view is of Bonhoeffer?
From what I hear, it's generally positive, but mixed. There are still some people who would probably still label him with traitor, and it might be with a sort of mixed feelings. So in the reading list that you'll probably get, there's a book. I think it's additional reading, and I forget what it's called. I'm going to bring it up on you. I don't need to share the screen, but I'm going to bring it up on my screen for myself. It's a fascinating book because I find it's helpful to think about context, right? What this person did, because Germany is just such a fascinating. I mean, you think about it. Angela Merkel, who just ended as 18, 19 years. She was from what was East Germany. It's called Broken Lives, and you'll get a chance to see that. But what this person does is they're actually a person with German roots, now in the United States, teaches, and they interviewed what they call the Weimar generation, so Germans who were born right after World War I. And through lengthy interviews and other things, and talk with them about their lives during the Weimar Republic, what little they knew, then during the rise of the Nazis, and then during World War II, and then during the divided Germany, Cold War years, and then when Germany was reunited, and what were their thoughts and feelings. And it's a fascinating read because you get people who this was awful, terrible. You get people who justify it. You get people who don't want to talk about it. So yeah, I mean, it's more recent, but it might be a little bit like, how much do we want to talk about race in the United States, right? In our history of slavery. So, that's part of the thing. Is mixed in is right. Their most recent experience isn't Nazism. The most recent experience is the Cold War and divided Germany. And that has its own kind of dynamic. So that's a good question. I would suspect generally favorable, but I'd be naive to think there aren't people that still aren't fans of his. I saw a hand.
Dale's got a comment. Dave, you had your hand up, Dave.
Well, I was just, I didn't realize the time had gone by so quickly. Great talk. I would be interested in his view on Romans 13. If you look at Jesus's life,
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of murder, a lot of people hanging on crosses beside the roads all over
Yeah.
the Holy Land. And he really didn't take a major stand against the Roman government.
Right.
And so I would be very interested in Bonhoeffer's admonishments in Romans 13 that, you know, I put all of the governments in place as your Lord. So, you know, be reverent.
Yeah, so Bonhoeffer, I think, would say what many have said is, what do you do when the government fails to do what God has put it in place to do? That would be Bonhoeffer's rationale. Is the government was put in place to, and I forget the quote, but God, you know, they wield the sword to keep peace and all that. And so in the extreme sense of Hitler, you go, okay, what's the government doing? You know, are they maintaining peace? And that was when he wrote, okay, so when the government isn't doing its part of serving God's purpose, what does the church do about that? And as I mentioned, there were 3 steps, and one of them was to, you know, speak up. I forget what the middle one was. The finally was to throw a spoke. Now, I would say even Jesus himself, he may not start a movement, but he didn't do what the Romans wanted him to do, which was to shut up. You know, it's like Jesus wasn't crucified because he had bad theology. It was because he was willing to let people call him king. Now we say my king is not of this world. And there's a bit of being in the Roman Empire that feels a little bit like being in Nazi Germany. People have sometimes said, well, you know, what about nonviolent resistance? Look what Gandhi did. And many people would say, well, they would have just killed Gandhi and anybody else who followed him. So the British in India are hard to compare with, you know, the Nazis in Germany. But yeah, I would say, so I wouldn't, so Jesus didn't seem to try and start a revolution. In fact, he was concerned about revolutions and the zealots, mainly because well, he stood in good prophetic tradition, right? There were times when Israel was threatened by Assyria and others, and they said, let's take up arms and fight them off. And the prophet said, that's not what God wants. You just need to let them come in, relax. Yeah, so I think Bonhoeffer's view of Romans 13, which would probably follow Luther, was, yeah, governments are servants of God. But when they stop serving God's purpose, then the question is, what do we do? Right? And I mean, in many ways, if you think about it, so there was the Roman government, and then there was the sort of Jewish government in Judea, represented by Herod and others. And Jesus kept getting in their face. But he wasn't going to grab a gun or a bow or whatever, you know, a spear. But he was not. And it's interesting that Paul, who writes that, is the one who defies the Roman authorities who tell him to shut up. So that's the Romans 13 is a little bit tricky. It does tell us that governments are instituted to serve God, but we would say so are churches. And when they stop doing it, then what do you do?
Right. Thank you.
Good question. Good question.
Just a quick takeoff. What I was thinking before Dave asked that is, where does turn the other cheek and in being complicit begin? Which kind of is a connection to what we're talking about, and then what Dave asked. I think that's an interesting concept.
Yeah, and I think the tricky part sometimes of some of the Sermon on the Mount stuff is how do you take it from my actions when I'm being attacked to my actions when others are being attacked, right? So Jesus is saying when somebody's slapping you, beating you around, here's what you do. It doesn't say, what do you do when you see somebody else being slapped around? Now, Romans 13 would say that's what the government's for, to prevent that from happening, right? And or bring punishment when it does. Yeah, that's Bonhoeffer. Okay, so now in this moment, right, from what we know of God's will, what seems like the best step in this moment, right? And then just in freedom, you do it, and you lean on God's forgiveness, not lightly or blithely, but yeah.
Steve, thank you for a very interesting and
Oh.
thought-provoking
You're
discussion.
welcome.
Very good.
Thank you for the opportunity. I just
I think I've heard you 3 times now on Bonhoeffer, and each time I learned something new. So,
oh, well, every time I read him, I learn. I'm actually in the process of one by one buying all those volumes, because it is fascinating to read his letters and lecture and some of his sort of human interest kind of stuff, but the kind of stuff he got involved in. Yeah.
thank you very much. And
My pleasure. Thank
you have an
you.
open door to come visit us anytime, or if you learned something new and want to share it, come talk
Thank
to us.
you. Thank you.
Have a great day, and thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
Steve, your wife volunteered you for this. She wanted,